Good morning, and for many of you, welcome to Wayne State University. I'm Mark Crewman. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Citizenship and chair of the Department of History. Delighted that you're here for the center's 8th and, alas, last conference. The center has been a love, a passion of mine for 10 years, but it appears as if it is not developing in the way that I had once hoped it would. Things have gone awry in ways that I'd rather not describe, but it is unfortunately last and I hope successful conference of the center. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Janine Lanza, a member of my department, to introduce our keynote speaker on April Fool's Day. The center happily is flourishing. My passion is undiminished. I was wondering if I was going to be able to carry it off with a straight face. Good. I've never been able to do that before, but I figured what better venue for it than this. Actually, the center's work is broad and broadening. Janine is shaking her head at me like, you idiot. It has indeed been a passion for the last 10 years since I spoke the words out loud, and since the first conference in 2004. It has been an exciting ride, and I trust that it will continue for many more years as we've moved into research on citizenship and health, research relating to civic engagement and gerontology, projects that involve the study of physician volunteering, corporate citizenship, transformation of coursework in our business school, plans for developing corporate citizenship training more broadly for startup and small businesses. The work of the center is expressed as well in the book series that we are just about to launch with the Wayne State University Press and Citizenship Studies. First volume should be out later this year. Those of you who are presenting at the conference, the best papers at the conference will be considered for inclusion in a peer-reviewed volume on basically the subject of this conference. So it is, and which will be, I think, happily anchored by the work of our distinguished keynote speakers. This is very exciting to me to have you all here. And I'm done with the April Fool's jokes, but I trust that you will have the same smile on your face at the end of the conference, though a bit more exhausted than you are right now. So I'm delighted that Kathleen Canning is here, and to introduce her, my very dear colleague, Janine Lanza.
Okay, I'd just like to start by saying every word I'm about to speak is bona fide. I do not believe in April Fool's pranks. I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Kathleen Canning, professor of history at the University of Michigan. Kathleen is currently working on a project that examines citizenship, gender, and sexuality in Germany during and after the First World War, as well as the theme of social movements and social interventions in that period, which obviously meshes extremely well with the conference and the Citizenship Center. This current research project follows several important books, and what really distinguishes Kathleen's work and makes it so important for scholars is her really deft understanding and application of theory, particularly the theory of language analysis, then the way she meshes that with a historian's understanding of past events and lived experiences. Her first book, Languages of Labor and Gender, published by Cornell in 1996, won the Central European Book Prize for 1996-97. Some of her more current books on Weimar politics, gender theory, and citizenship include Gender History in Practice, as well as Weimar Publics, Weimar Subjects, Rethinking the Political Culture of Germany in the 1920s, which is forthcoming, or is it out? It's out. It's out, okay. Kathleen also has explored these issues in an extremely impressive number of articles appearing in journals and collected volumes. Her research has been supported by a slew of prestigious fellowships, including most recently a Michigan Humanities Award and a fellowship at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies in Germany, as well as an NEH Fellowship, a German Marshall Fund Award, and a stint at the Stanford Humanities Center. In addition to her work as a scholar and teacher, Kathleen directed the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, housed at the University of Michigan, which encourages interdisciplinary and collaborative study of the past, of which I was a very happy beneficiary. Her talk today comes out of her current book project, which is entitled Gender and Citizenship in the Aftermath of War and Revolution in Germany, 1918 to 1930. And Kathleen's talk today is entitled The Stakes of Citizenship, Bodies in the Aftermath of War and Revolution. Welcome, Kathleen.
Okay, well, I'm glad that was an April Fool's joke. I was trying to figure out, okay, so what is the proper demeanor if you're giving an address? Oh, so yeah, it would have made me extremely sad if you had not been kidding. Since I've wondered in the last years about your work and was so busy building and then running the institute at Michigan, the Eisenberg Institute, that I didn't have a chance to really come by and see what you do here at the Center for Citizenship Studies, so I'm very happy to be here. I really thank you all for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure the last years to have colleagues from Wayne State at the Institute almost every year. I think we've had at least one. So soon we'll work our way through your whole department, I imagine. And even if I'm no longer host, I'm still around there. So it's great to work together. Today I'm not sure I really need this mic. Do you guys, I'll push it away a little because it's too close. I'm talking to you about a work in progress, which is always somewhat perilous because there's a lot of texture and detail in my hands that I try to spare you. And it's sometimes difficult to step back from the material. So I hope we have a chance to talk about some of these things. The talk is entitled The Stakes of Citizenship, Bodies in the Aftermath of War and Revolution. And the actual focus is going to be more about bodies in the process of war and revolution. The aftermath is something that I'm still working on. So in January 1918, when Anna Bloss was elected to the National Assembly, this is the first democratic elected body in Germany after World War I and the Revolution of 1918. So when she was elected to the National Assembly as the only female delegate from Württemberg, a flood of mail arrived at her office from female constituents. The letters and postcards to Anna Bloss from her constituents, oops, my mic is just going like, bye. I don't know what's going on there. I probably shouldn't have touched it.
You need the mic.
I do need it? Okay, just wait 1 second. Let me see if I can pull it back up. There, okay, super. I just didn't want to bend or break it. Okay, so when Anna was elected to the National Assembly as the only female delegate from Württemberg, a flood of mail arrived at her office from female constituents. The letters and postcards to Anna Bloss from female voters offer a rare glimpse into the hopes and meanings Germans assigned to citizenship in the wake of Germany's defeat, the November Revolution of 1918, and the contests over forms of governance that were still going on in January 1919. In the days and weeks after the revolution, Anna Bloss became a highly visible interpreter of the revolution's unexpected gift to women, the right to vote. Many of the letters reflected on the meanings of citizenship in the future tense, noting that Frau Bloss, along with other delegates, now had Germany's future in her hands. New women voters noted their own need for schooling in the exercise of citizenship rights, while others wasted no time in presenting their own claims and visions as newly named citizens. So this was kind of a find I stumbled into in the archives, these postcards and letters to this female delegate in which women had just been named voters, and they just wrote off to the first woman elected from their region saying, "Dear Frau Bloss, we hope you will do this and this," and it was really very exciting to find this. So, although the founding of democracy in 1919 marked a momentous expansion of citizenship rights in the history of German constitution writing, citizenship has been a largely absent concept in German history. This is particularly striking for the history of Weimar Germany, in which an unusually vibrant democratic political culture took shape, and when the stakes of both democracy and citizenship were extraordinarily high. Not least because of this absence, my own study has been informed from the start by engagement with critical studies of citizenship from other disciplines and historiographies. It's also been shaped by a longstanding interdisciplinary engagement with politics, culture, and gender in Weimar Germany, with students and scholars in other disciplines, literature, art history, film studies, and political science. So the challenge of my book project and some of my articles has involved less the application of an existing analytic of citizenship into my historical case study, but the work of crafting an analytic that actually opens up the history of Weimar democracy, not only to gender, but also to those realms of political culture in which the many crucial dimensions of citizenship were defined beyond political parties and parliaments. So there's no notion of citizenship at all in the history of Weimar Germany. It just isn't in the historiography at all. So I could have just adopted an existing and used it to work with the history of parliaments and parties, but I'm interested in politics well beyond that realm. So it's really forced me to push at the definitions of citizenship and craft kind of my own definition. In my approach, I also view citizenship as part of the landscape of danger and design that historian Peter Fritsche described in one of his classic essays on Weimar modernism. Citizenship should also be part of the critical rethinking of the teleology of crisis associated with Weimar democracy that a younger generation of cultural historians has initiated, which has emphasized that the rhetorics and experience of crisis in Weimar Germany were not always negative, did not always signal danger, decline, or collapse, but were characterized instead by a particularly modern Machtbarkeit, that is, the capacity to invent, improvise, resolve, or remake the self, the body, social identities. This project has taken shape then as part of a broader rethinking of the Weimar Republic that emphasizes the formations of new publics and new subjects, not only of voters and activists propelled into politics by Germany's defeat, revolution, and the contests over democracy, but also those convened by changes in welfare, culture, media consumption, and body politics. So that includes veterans, war widows, street fighters, flaneurs, new women, new men, members of the viewing public, and the reading public, activists for reproductive rights. So let me tell you a little bit about my definition of citizenship. The ambitions of this project have required me to crack open the German categories of citizenship in order to resolve the semantic dissonances that have accompanied my project from its beginning, stemming from the emphasis in German history on citizenship as national belonging. So there's this term, Staatsangehörigkeit, which means technically to belong to the state. And that term really signals the rights you have as a member of a national community to be protected by the military of that state, to carry an identification from that state, et cetera. So in fact, the English term citizenship is a far more capacious and open-ended term than either of the German terms Staatsangehörigkeit, belonging to the state, or the more generic Staatsbürgerschaft, which is simply to be a citizen of a state, but it doesn't specify what kind of citizenship rights. And Bürger also has the resonance and the meaning of being a middle-class person. So it's sort of Staatsbürger. It's got a lot of ambiguities. The starting point for German citizenship, that is, this national belonging, denotes a formal, legally defined relationship of adherence to the state. Jürgen Habermas has described this as a citizenship that is, in fact, beholden to the state. Dieter Gosewinkel makes a similar point about Staatsbürgerschaft, which has typically been so enclosed, he argues, in the sphere of the state that it has remained virtually untouched by reality and civil society, by the class contrast between bourgeoisie and proletariat, and, we might add, by the category of sexual difference. Writing in 1969, political scientist Paul Ludwig Weihnacht observed that Staatsbürgerschaft had simply disappeared as an issue in 20th century German legal thought. Its relevance, he concluded, belonged to the bourgeois 19th century and must have passed along with it. As the principle of descent increasingly became the true national principle of belonging to the state, that is, in the German case, the political notion of Staatsbürger was gradually reduced to the meaning of Staatsangehörige, of national belonging. And this, Gosewinkel determines, is the specific German contribution to the semantic field of citizenship, namely the interchangeability of these two terms. And what these mean for me is when I say citizenship, I have to use the English term when I'm speaking in Germany, because it does not work to use one of those terms. And precisely my point that you don't find a living, breathing definition of citizenship in 20th century German history until the fall of the wall is that this is exactly right. This term of national belonging and the sense that Germany's citizenship has been so overwhelmed by the history of the Third Reich and its extraordinary perversion of this principle of descent has really stripped the analytic vocabulary right out of the field that I work in. So I'm trying to put it back in. And then I'm trying to put gender in it and also embody it, so it really gets very challenging. So second, I've had to push on this analytical language of citizenship to identify the historically specific ways in which citizenship was gendered and embodied, a task for which there are virtually no models in German history. So I've taken my inspiration from literatures that are quite distant from my field, from the disparate studies, cultural studies, sociology, feminist and gender studies, US history, Latin American history, all of which have much richer and deeper theories and historical studies of citizenship. Both the history and theory of citizenship in the UK, those fields have seriously explored spheres beyond formal politics, especially those of consumption and popular culture, and more recently, sexuality and reproductive rights as sites of citizenship, but these studies tend to be rather focused on the contemporary period. So I've learned a lot from US historian Nancy Cott, who argues that women's citizenship was not a definitive either-or proposal. It was not the case that one was or was not a citizen, but she sees citizenship as a continuum of rights, expectations, and claims that she terms compromisable. In a historical explication of the difference between active and passive citizenship in the French Revolution, historical sociologist William H. Sewell views citoyenne as a term to conjure with, one that can't really be confined to its most rigorous legal definitions. Rather, citoyenne was packed with multiple ambiguous and contradictory meanings that became a focus of passionate political struggles. Approaching citizenship as a term to conjure with, or as a category of claims making, draws attention to the ways in which the experiences of citizenship did not always adhere to its discursive or legal prescriptions, making clear the importance of the intervening and acting subject in histories of citizenship. I'm also intrigued by the notion of intimate citizenships that Elżbieta Oleski has recently proposed in a book of the same name. This concept takes as a given the intersections between the private and public dimensions of individual lives. The concept of intimate citizenship shifts the focus to how subjects' private decisions and practices become intertwined with public institutions and state policies, such as public discourse on sexuality, legal codes, the medical system, family policy, the media, and others. The citizenship I am primarily interested in my project is that which is explicitly missing in the history of Weimar democracy, and I call it participatory citizenship. This term first refers to the legal terms of participation in politics, society, or culture, as spelled out first by the codes and practices of governance, that is law, administration, welfare, the military, and secondly, as prescribed by ideologies, norms, and knowledges and practices outside the realm of the state, those of science, medicine, or pedagogy, for example, that qualify or disqualify citizens based, or potential citizens based on their capacities for citizenship. Participatory citizenship encompasses, in the second dimension, the citizen's subjective sense of possessing rights, entitlements, and duties within a state, as well as the capacity of citizens and those with merely partial or incomplete citizenship to state claims that widen or alter the terms or meanings of citizenship. My study examines three moments. The current place I am in my book is the first half, examines three moments in the history of citizenship and gender in Germany during and after the First World War. So I turn now to my case study. The first is the inception of citizenship as a new language of social protest and claims making during the First World War. Second is the proclamation of new participatory rights in the November Revolution of 1918. And third is their inscription of citizenship rights in the writing of the Weimar Constitution of 1919. The second half of the book then goes on to analyze what meanings these new citizenship rights had, both in the formal realm of politics and outside of them, which is very hard. I contend that citizenship had become a political language amidst a complex of crises on the home front after 1916. The material crises of distribution, of food, coal, and labor, the political crises of governance, of annexation and peace, and the so-called sexual crisis that conjoined disparate concerns about the birth rate, venereal disease, prostitution, and perceptions of female sexual licentiousness. Since our focus at this conference is bodies in relation to citizenship, and the relationship between bodies and sexuality is by no means a straightforward one, I will posit that the body, that these discourses, in a sense almost a panic about sexual crisis during and after World War I, rendered the body a new site of governance. The body as the visible or tangible location of sexuality would be cast as the site of intervention and repair. So as you might see, I'm trying to map the inception and then the inscription and instatement of citizenship onto a history of crisis and disorder, and then the process of reordering that takes place in the founding of democracy. So this is a complicated argument. So I'll give you the absolute bullet points. Women and working class men won suffrage rights as one of the first outcomes of the November Revolution at the height of a crisis of governance. And here there were revolutionary councils were formed, and there were really two models of governance that were deeply contesting each other's right. One was the councils and the more radical vision of a truly democratic society with including expropriation of industry partially, and the other was votes. So like the participatory citizenship that I start with is already fractured at the inception of, at the end of World War I between these two models. The massive wave of politicization that took place following the German defeat and revolution swept millions of women into parties and unions as they sought to make sense of the transformations of wartime to learn quickly the civic codes of citizenship and to prove themselves capable of citizenship. The perception that the sexual order had ruptured at the end of the war forms an important backdrop for the writing and enactment of citizenship through the Weimar Constitution between February 1919 and the elections of January 1920. Writing citizenship ultimately marked the first step in a process of reordering and reconciling state and civil society, women and men. The transcripts of the National Assembly, the pages of the daily papers, and the pages of the daily papers make clear that this process took place against the backdrop of mass death, grief, despair, and destitution. The restoration that the Constitution sought, placed the bodies of citizens in a new relationship to the emergent republics, situating men and women as equal citizens whose bodily sacrifices for the nation formed the basis of their new rights. These passages subtly paid tribute to soldiers and to the women who had held down the home front while outlining newly embodied citizenship rights regarding the state's protection of family, labor, and motherhood. Now, I don't have time today to go into the parameters of citizenship before the war, so let me just say that when I say it's a new language, I mean that it takes on a new vibrance, and it encompasses much wider groups of people, and it actually is much more focused on claims and in a direct relationship, direct confrontation to the state. Of course, citizenship languages and notions of rights were framed in the pre-war period in a number of ways. One was the National Constitution, which gave universal suffrage to men in Germany as a nation, but not in Prussia, the largest state. There, the three-class suffrage was retained. So the largest group of working class men and the most militant social democrats still did not have the right to vote. The second place would have been the new law of national belonging, the 1913 law of citizenship that pertained to descent and the rights of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe to emigrate to Germany, and exactly the opposite, what happens to your citizenship when you emigrate out of Germany, etc. Thirdly, the civil code that determined the rights of property owning, inheritance, marriage, child rearing. And fourthly, protective labor legislation. So those are all sites at which citizenship is structured, there's no question. I would say that the rights of women to citizenship were shaped primarily by the battle over the Prussian three-class suffrage, which was exclusively an issue of men's suffrage. But that issue was in the foreground and overshadowed the debates about women's suffrage for the most part, certainly in the realm of social democracy. The other important backdrop for debates about citizenship in the pre-war period was, of course, the international feminist movement that overlapped significantly with feminist pacifism, and that in which women, feminist activists from all of the European countries and the US communicated regularly, met yearly, and advocated female suffrage up until 1915. And then those efforts were basically abandoned, and the German feminist group, with the exception of one, withdrew from these international groups because of the need to adhere to the standpoint of defending the fatherland. So that's my brief overview of the pre-war period. So even as the war, and I will also note that the largest organization of middle-class feminists in Germany was split over the issue of suffrage. So conservative and Protestant feminists absolutely did not feel they needed the right to vote. So when we entered this situation of World War I, the largest group is split, and really the most lively advocates for the right to vote were female social democrats, and the Social Democratic Party also endorsed the right to vote, and a highly educated group of women liberals who basically shaped welfare reform in the pre-war period through their studies and their work as kind of early pre-social workers. So even as the war divided opinion in German feminist circles, which it also did, the increasingly feminized home front became a laboratory of citizenship, I argue, a site both shaped by pre-war discourses on women's rights and by women's unprecedented experiences of total war as it reorganized their lives on the home front. With the outbreak of war in 1914, the state conscripted citizens in defense of the nation, a deployment that was to last 6 weeks and end in victory. As such, the war mobilized the status of duty, of Pflichtigkeit, which deepened a sense of national belonging, a process that some German historians have viewed as welding Germans across class lines into a folk for the first time in 1914. But it did so by mobilizing those who belonged to the nation to perform their duties as citizens. Thus, the outbreak of war had the effect of nationalizing both the notions of belonging and participation, while intensifying the state's reliance upon both men and women's performance of their duties as citizens. Not only the new forms of conscription of men and women, but the day-to-day structural transformations of state, civil society, family, and labor opened spaces for citizenship claims that would not have been thinkable before the war. Citizenship became a new semantic of claims and belonging on the German home front, where initial identifications with the nation soon fractured in the face of the hardships of war, spilling into mass protests for bread, suffrage, and peace, without annexations that became more frequent during and after the winter of 1916. New social groups, women of lesser means or war widows, formed as they contended with the desperate conditions of war by staking new claims upon by staking new claims upon the militarized state. So there's some great books on the war period itself and on the ways in which entirely new groups formed and had this consciousness of belonging to women of lesser means who stood in the breadlines and formed a political view of the war and exchanged news about who died, and because censorship was extremely difficult to break through. So this informal public sphere became the sphere in which these citizenship claims were shaped. As the divide deepened between the militarized state and the civil public, the demands for material goods like bread, coal, and higher wages intermingled with the longing for representation, participation, and peace without annexations. With the politicization of nearly every realm of daily life, from the allocation of labor to the provisioning of food and coal, to worry about birth rates and sexual behavior, the semantic of citizenship reached into wider circles of civilians well beyond social democracy. The worsening material conditions during 1917, the revolutionary outcome in Russia, and the founding of the independent Social Democratic Party fueled more vehement demands for democratization and suffrage. From the perspective of military and civilian authorities, suffrage reform came to be viewed as a crucial means of negotiating the consent of both soldiers and workers, that is men and women, to the continuation of the war. Conceding to civilians' demands for citizenship rights was viewed by many, including the Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, as the only means of preventing a revolutionary eruption in Germany. As a new semantic of claims upon the state, the citizenship that was incubated in this laboratory of the home front was explicitly and increasingly gendered and embodied. That's another argument I'm trying to make today. Social Democrats and left liberals who insisted that the equal and universal obligation to military service that had drawn millions of workers to the front must be matched by the equal and universal right to vote outlined in this rhetoric. They outlined new terms for male citizenship rights, grounded in national military service rather than class or economic position. Interestingly, Max Weber, the great sociologist, cast the still contested suffrage rights in 1917 in explicitly, if ironically, bodily terms. So here I'm showing you, I found this wonderful quote from Weber, and I'm showing you the ways in which the bodily experiences of war form the backdrop for arguing why citizenship rights had to be enacted. So this is called, his essay is called On German Democracy and the Right to Vote. Equal suffrage, seen from the angle of state policy, is parallel to the equality of certain fates that the modern state creates. Human beings are equal in the face of death. They are similarly equal with regard to the most inseparable needs insuperable needs of bodily life, these vulgar aspects of life, as well as those that are solemnly sublime, Weber, encompasses the equalities the modern state must definitely offer its citizens, the exclusively physical basis of well-being for a minimum standard of living, and of course the battlefield as a site of death. So this is the irony. In the face of the leveling effects of the inescapably hegemonic bureaucracy that has allowed the modern concept of Staatsbürger, of citizen, to emerge, the ballot is the sole means to endow subordinate subjects with minimum rights to deliberate and decide those matters of society for which they must be prepared to die. So that's Max Weber on the right of men to vote. The emphasis on citizens' equal service as the basis for equal citizenship rights in the deliberations of 1917 certainly referred to men at the front, but it also had important implications for women who had joined the war efforts in unprecedented numbers, whether in the National Women's Service, in the munitions factories, or as nurses at the front. So we have highly organized women in battalions of all of these service sectors who are looked at as the female soldiers on the home front. However, inadvertently, the state authorized and rewarded a new public role for women in wartime, reviving and rewriting pre-war feminist claims for equal rights, which were taken up by ever wider circles of politicized women as the war dragged on. Henrietta Fürth, a social democrat, sought to capture these changes in her study, German Women in the War, published in 1917. The unbelievable events, she said, the unbelievable events of the war revolutionized the entire existence of women in a fashion that one could have never imagined before the war began, or even in its early phase, no one would have thought this was possible. From the chaos, a new formation is now emerging, a new formation of the broad dimensions of which we can scarcely glimpse, end quote. Moreover, as the war effort drew upon ever-widening circles of women, the ranks of those envisioning and claiming citizenship swelled considerably beyond the groups of pre-war suffrage advocates. The language of citizenship resonated among conservative and nationalist women, as well as social democrats, some of whom, the nationalist and conservative women, had opposed suffrage before 1914, but came to regard their wartime service as a new basis for citizenship rights, anticipating as well that German women's motherly influence would be even more urgently needed after the war. As much as conservative or religious women's groups may have forsworn notions of equality or emancipation before 1914, the conduct of war and the gendering of its two fronts opened an experiential chasm between women and men in which visions of citizenship began to take shape. In the view of conservative Ilse Rilke, the citizenship that formed across this divide grew out of the female expertise acquired in contending with the bodily and social effects of the war. Quote, "For all of our efforts as citizens and patriots aim to work against the outcomes of the war by dressing the wounds of soldiers, caring for the crippled and maimed, comforting the widows and orphans, rebuilding the homes that have been destroyed," end quote. Elizabeth Zilliken, active in the circles of Catholic social reform and writing about women's citizenship obligations in 1916, took stock of the war's bloody toll, which had become palpable not only for working women, but also for those who had not been drawn into war production. For housewives, too, the toll of the war is palpable, she said, am eigenen Leib, in their own bodies. For even the smallest rural household is inextricably connected to the economic system of the whole country, something that many women only came to realize during the war. Proposing that there was virtually no space where citizenship was irrelevant, Zilliken emphasized that the family is no longer a circle closed unto itself. Rather, hundreds of threads connect the circle now to public life and pull the individual members into the public. Dr. Marie Baum, a former factory inspector and future delegate of the Democratic Party to the Reichstag, suggested that the lazarettes had become schools of both social expertise and citizenship for many young women, emphasizing the need to politicize the life forces, those were her words, politicize the life forces, people's health, nutrition, and education by training those who oversee them. Not only had new spaces opened on the home front for middle-class women to supervise the sphere of the social, but the war also dissolved all divides between the private households and political economy, individuals, and nation state, prompting middle-class women to reimagine the terms of their participation in both politics and the social. When the Protestant middle-class women's movement, which had still opposed the right to vote in 1914, embraced the role of women as what they called Staatstragende, those who literally carry the state, whose contributions as citizens would be vital to the restoration of the nation in the aftermath of war. Social democratic and radical pacifist activists spoke a language of rights and anticipated participation in a revolutionary transformation. So just as we're getting to the end of the war, you have very different visions of what women's role as citizens should be. The conservatives argued, we shall carry the state and we will help restore the nation by essentially carrying the state and carrying the state. And I will also note, because I won't be able to cover that, that some of them really despised the fact that they received these rights through a revolution. So they said, you know, it's horrible that we got these rights through a revolution, but we will seize them and use them to save the nation, basically, from those very revolutionary forces. But so it's really interesting to see the kind of different ways in which rhetorics of citizenship get taken up. And they're very vibrant. Louisa Zietz, who was a social democrat, echoed the impression of Ilse Rieke that men bore the responsibility for the war, noting that women who had not participated in the decision to go to war were now nonetheless forced to bear its economic, social, and political burdens. Unlike her middle-class compatriots, for Zietz, citizenship did not have a moral or sentimental cast. Rather, class inequalities were in the forefront of the citizenships she sought to enact. Addressing poor and working class women as future citizens, Zietz castigated the subtle and disenfranchising hierarchies that underwrote wartime social welfare, especially the practice of subjecting war wives and widows to tests of their need and worthiness for state social assistance. This assistance, she argued, was a social right, not an act of benevolence or charity, nor did it represent a handout from rich to poor. Rather than a barrier to citizenship rights or a marker of second-class citizenship, the right of soldiers' families to claim and receive social benefits in wartime was absolutely intrinsic to citizenship in her view. With the slogan, not charity, but rights are what we claim, Zietz called for a citizenship that would fulfill the rights and claims of soldiers' wives, which were anchored in law. Citizenship was imagined as both a material and symbolic remuneration for the grave conditions soldiers' wives had endured during the war. Zietz drew connections between women's lack of citizenship rights and their bodily vulnerabilities in wartime. She stoked citizenship, oh no, I'm gonna jump ahead. At the same time as Zietz advocated for working class widows and for the children of soldiers, war widows became another key category and a newly mobilized group with their own set of claims. Robert Whalen's now older study of the bitter wounds of war highlights the growing rage of war widows that drove them into public protest against the war and against the stinginess of the state regarding their pensions. Educated by war, by its human costs, economic deprivation, and the long-term prospect of single motherhood, war widows too began to speak the language of citizenship as they mobilized to place their demands before the state. As women were drawn into much more direct subjection to and surveillance by the state, especially after 1916, the potential for both conflict and transformations of consciousness grew. Among the flashpoints were the state's own wide-ranging attempts to acquire an overview of women's locations and bodily capacities for labor, for childbearing, and for national service in the new political economy of the home front. The state's own desire to render women identifiable, accessible, and deployable was an undertaking that was impossible for female civilians to ignore, whether appeals to women as volunteers or in the contemplation of more coercive measures, such as the forced internment of female laborers for work in agriculture and in the intensified surveillance of soldiers' wives, particularly of their sexual lives on the home front. New spaces of consciousness, negotiation, and subversion arose as female civilians became aware of their own indispensability to the militarized state. The abandonment of protective measures at a time when the need for female labor was most acute opened other possibilities for distancing and critique, not least because the war on the home front began to reveal its own bodily perils, from unrestricted work hours to the handling of toxic powders and chemical ammunition components that sometimes singed or yellowed the skin and hair. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that the caloric intake by 1917 for most women, including those who worked a full, long day in the munitions factories, was 800 calories. I think it was 200,000 civilians died of hunger on the home front during World War I. Many of them, these women who were holding down these munitions jobs. And there's many descriptions by women of like nursing their babies but not having any milk and watching their babies die at their breasts. So there's an extraordinary body story of World War I to be told. And as historian Karen Hausen has noted, the kind of suffering of women has never been written into the story of the war. It's just kind of always a separate story, and it doesn't have much to do with kind of the real dramas of World War I. The effects of censorship and restrictions on women's right to assemble under military rule were yet another issue, and they were the constant reminder of the lack of participatory rights. And this was actually often a kind of life and death issue. The circumscription of civil rights inhibited more than potential political criticism of the war, but also stifled the sociability of survival on the home front, those exchanges of everyday knowledge and information that took place as women bargained on the black market in bread lines or shared news of troop movements or reports of the fallen. So what I'm arguing here is that as the state grew larger and was present in every realm of life, so whether it was surveillance or distribution or regulation of the market or regulation of the hours of work, women they fell under the view of the state and the sort of policies of the state, and they thus also responded to this transformed attention in all the realms of their life by staking these new claims. It's kind of my argument. I'm watching the time. As a laboratory of citizenship, the home front also became a site of perceived gender disorder, or in more explicit terms, of sexual crisis. Debates about the sexual question and perceptions of sexual crisis swirled through the Central European milieus of social, medical, and hygienic reform during the first decade of the 20th century, laying the groundwork for the discipline of sexology and crisscrossing with eugenicist concerns about population quality and quantity, with radical feminist campaigns for free love, the first stirrings of a movement for homosexual emancipation, and a lively birth strike debate among German social democrats on the eve of the war. Against the backdrop of the disastrous loss of male life at the front and the prospect of a longer-term female surplus, German military and medical authorities, conservatives and nationalists, saw in these changes a cumulative and irreversible process of feminization that threatened to erupt into a full-fledged sexual crisis once the war had ended and soldiers returned. So by 1918 summer, 2 million German men had fallen, another 1.5 million were injured and maimed, and there was going to be a longer-term excess of women of around 2 million. And this was something that was totally preoccupying military authorities. So I went through in the Berlin Geheimes Staatsarchiv these documents of the military and medical authorities who were just obsessed about increasing the birth rate. But you're like, how are they going to increase the birth rate when there's almost no men of this age group at home, and women's sexual behavior is policed, and they're supposed to have children only within marriage. And so this is one of those really intriguing contradictions. But they were seeking to fix this problem during the war, which really is very puzzling. So this semantic of sexual crisis reflected worries about more than just the birth rate, also about the incursion of women into male sectors of labor and the professions, and anxieties about whether one would be able to get them out of the workplace when the soldiers had returned. was also an enormous worry about a newfound sexual independence on the part of single women and soldiers' wives. Here I should note that I'm intentionally using the term sexual crisis instead of gender crisis because the perceived sexual ungovernability of women in wartime, parallel to that of men in trenches, represented a particular threat to the militarized state. Demographic changes, such as the declining rates of marriage and birth, and the rising rates of venereal disease and infertility, as well as this irreversible female surplus, fueled the semantic of sexual disorder. In the context of total war, control over sexual and reproductive behavior became a matter of intensified governance. From its earliest articulations on the home front, the idea of female citizenship had been a site of anxiety about the wartime transformations of femininity and masculinity among conservatives and nationalists. So as early as 1915, the nationalist right associated female citizenship with a sense of foreboding about the future of the German family, the ability of men to wrest their jobs back and breadwinner status back from women after the war, and about the consequences longer term of the sexual demoralization that had taken place during the war. That means women's infidelity and infertility. As the state's dependence on female labor deepened with the passage of the Hindenburg Law in 1916, fears of a gender war of the cruelest sort swirled through nationalist as well as liberal political arenas. The highest level ministers and military commanders began to evaluate the effects of the mass mortality of German men of reproductive age, initiating a militarized Bevölkerungspolitik, or population politics, and seeking to avert a post-war sexual crisis. And this was as early as 1916, when most of them were assured of a German victory. So you can imagine that as it became clear that Germany would lose the war, this sense of crisis, of a gender war or sexual sort of ungovernability of both sexes became sharper. So a punitive nationalism took shape not only in the bureaucracies of military and state, but also in the rhetoric of nationalist groups that held women responsible for the work of replenishing the population in the aftermath of war. This took very specific forms, such as calling for a fundamental reckoning with the political women's organizations, which were blamed for favoring the development of free personalities over the duty to conceive, give birth, and raise children. Calling up the memory of the birth strike debate of 1912, nationalist activists speculated that radical feminists and socialist critics of the war were able to disseminate information about birth control through women's informational networks on the home front. In 1916, the newly founded League for Population Policy convened a conference on the topic of women's work and population policy, which explored the practicability of mandatory measures that were aimed to break down what they called the immunity of German women to pronatalist propaganda. Wartime population policy increasingly centered on the spread of venereal disease from soldiers to their civilian wives and back, and on the obviously widespread use of contraception by women and men. The Reichstag Committee on Population Policy convened 10 sessions in 1918 to address the urgent matter of venereal disease in the troops and in the entire folk, concluding that the prevention of conception should now become an offense punishable by law. Female citizenship took shape against this backdrop, but held out an entirely different post-war prospect, namely that the transformation of the gender order would not be temporary at all, but would be rendered permanent by the ascription of women's citizenship rights, which increasingly threatened to become a cornerstone of a post-war democracy that nationalists and conservatives deeply feared. The recognition that the woman question would be a problem that was extremely difficult to solve after the war, particularly if women gained these rights, fueled the efforts of nationalist groups like the League to Combat Women's Emancipation to portray female suffrage and sexual self-determination as a force that threatens the marrow of our people more than any other force. The search for measures became increasingly desperate by 1917 and 18 as military doctors and commanders sought to counter the really enormous loss of life and this perceived feminization by sharpening the penalties for dissemination of information about birth control and abortion, and by tightening the scrutiny of soldiers, young wives, and young working women. The virtual obsession with female reproductivity prompted energetic responses from feminists across the political spectrum. In the second volume of The Sexual Crisis, Grete Meisel-Hess commented sardonically on the endless sea of words that poured out on the question of the population loss already in the second winter of the war, and on the scapegoating of the women's movement regarding the declining birth rate. This is my last quote, and then I'm going to move to conclusion. This is Grete Meisel-Hess. Although the zealots have thrown themselves into imposing on our dejected people a national enthusiasm for bearing children, sentiments and the social and economic prerequisites are entirely lacking at present. Never has a sexual drive, purely instinctually, diminished or constrained itself so fully, more than now, when the fields of corpses stretch endlessly before us, when these sites of battle are fertilized with the cadavers of the most robust masculinity of our people. And we at home should think about making love, conceiving, or birthing children under these conditions. So now at the height of mobilization for female citizenship during the winter and spring of 1918, the right to bodily integrity and reproductive self-determination acquired new meanings as crucial prerequisites for the exercise of political rights. Indeed, the state's interpolation of women's bodies as the source at which the recovery of lost human material must begin only served to heighten women's attention to the significance of their bodies as sites of potential citizenship. So, I'm going to just summarize what happens from here on. So the arrival of citizenship coincided with the disaster of the German defeat and the bewilderment and exhilaration that followed the revolution and collapse of the Kaiserreich. Equal, active, and passive suffrage for men and women over the age of 20 became one of the very first outcomes of the November Revolution, proclaimed by the Provisional Revolutionary Government of majority and independent Social Democrats. While many contemporaries viewed the ascription of citizenship rights as inevitable, even a just reward granted to women and to male workers in return for and in recognition of their profound sacrifices for the war effort, others noted that the legal proclamation of rights was a necessary concession to the revolutionary movements, and thus represented a vital step towards ending the revolution and achieving social peace. And what goes on after this is that we see an incredible outburst on the part of energy and imagination on the part of feminists from all of these different sectors about what this right to vote means, and the backdrop of war and of these experiences I've been describing and these discourses about the female body and reproduction were very formative of their understanding of their citizenship rights. So one of the most prevalent tropes in sort of women's reflections on, okay, we have to make these rights, we have to enact them, we have to learn how to practice them, we have to teach all these uneducated women how to vote, how to be citizens. A constant trope is that this newly won right rests on the graves of 2 million men, that we are voting essentially to, in a sense, to come to terms with this extraordinarily and, we have to say, a traumatizing experience. So they talk about voting rights in terms like this. What kind of female suffering do these figures encompass, those who have to vote? What kind of anguish on the part of mothers, wives, lovers, daughters, and sisters can be expressed here? Germany has been drained and stripped of its riches. It's now a pawn in its enemies' visions of revenge and hatred, so they're anticipating already the punitive terms of peace. And precisely in these grim times, women acquire the right to vote. So if I go on to tell you that women voted in huge numbers, it was like 85, 87% participation rate in the first election, and a similar rate in the next Democratic election, which actually sent 38 delegates to the Reichstag. After this, the participation of women in elections remains high, but they don't vote in ways that progressive or social democrats had wished. They tend to vote very much in political milieus in which they were formed. So we see a large mobilization of conservative women voters and Catholic women voters, for example. So this is part of why I move outside in the next part of my book of this realm of formal politics to actually assess the ways in which citizenship as it is written, in a sense, the various codes, especially those pertaining to family and including unwed motherhood, to family motherhood, property ownership, and child rearing, and so on, really seek to reorder this gender, to reorder the gender relations that have been perceived as having gone awry, and to kind of alleviate a perceived sexual crisis by one, offering state support to the family so that in both hygienic and material terms, and another, just kind of reaffirming that women's bodily contributions to the nation are valued and are most directed towards motherhood. So so citizenship takes shape in crisis. It is a vital part of the reordering of the founding of democracy, which is not what I had hoped to find when I set out. And finally, I'll just let you know that I'm going to read you my last paragraph because I want to give you just a glimpse of what else I'm trying to do with it in the second half of my book. The naming of women as citizens, even if intended to modernize, yet reorder gender and sexuality, set into motion processes that neither law nor realms of formal politics could ultimately contain. Not only was citizenship not containable within the strictures of the Constitution, but competing notions of citizenship jockeyed to fill the unprecedented vacuum of political power that was created in the early years of the Weimar Republic through constant elections and changing governments. Citizenship also authorized a different presence of women in public, and I think this is its real significance. Transforming female figures, even those not explicitly positioned in politics, into objects of anxiety and unease, now in particular because they were not just in public, but they were citizens. Even if we know that they didn't always do disruptive things with those rights, the perception that they could not be sent back into the home is partially shaped by the fact that they actually gained these rights. It is significant that none of the visions of citizenship bandied about in the National Assembly made a pretense of universality. Rather, each approached negotiations over citizenship as one site for the re-articulation of norms and ideologies of gender that would realign the relationships between the sexes and thereby resolve the post-war gender crisis. The inscription of explicitly differentiated, embodied citizenship rights now assigned women a particular place in the founding of Republican democracy and the rejuvenation of the nation. The postulates of citizenship anchored in those early years would continue to unsettle the Republic throughout the 20s, neither fulfilled nor wholly expunged from its political culture. Indeed, the participatory politics I term citizenship helped to generate and sustain Weimar's democratic project, yet remained a crucial site of contested rights and claims. The embodied terms of citizenship would foster new subjectivities and new claims of female citizens who, rather than accepting the institutional or legal terms of citizenship, would embody themselves in their campaigns and in their claims for maternity protection, for the rights to birth control and abortion, for example. So I'm trying to argue that in so explicitly embodying women as citizens in this reordering that took place through the Constitution, and I think also with this extraordinarily embodied experience of the war, women who do enter into this public sphere use rhetorics of citizenship to essentially define their own bodies as sites of citizenship, and this is very visible in my 2 chapters on maternity protection and on the struggle over reproductive rights at the end of the Weimar Republic. So while women's citizenship by no means led to anything like emancipation, the various points of citizenship changed the perception of women in the various publics of the Weimar Republic. So essentially, we see in the spheres of those intensely politicized spheres that essentially became politically, really became politicized through the Weimar Republic, that is consumption, visual culture, film and body, literature, and the body and reproductive politics. These spheres in which entirely new initiatives took place were the spheres in which these citizenship rights essentially played out and had meaning, not in the realms of parties and parliaments. And that's part of why I've had to stretch open both citizenship and this notion of the public to see these spheres where women did actually make those citizenship rights meaningful. Thank you. So.
I think we have a couple minutes for questions, and then we'll continue the conversation over lunch at McGregor. That's not a joke.
I have a question. Well, I'll give you a choice. It's a choice question. One is, would you like to answer a question about applying what you said so wonderfully to a contemporary context, or would you rather me give you a question about your actual?
Well, no, let's try that. Let's try the first one, because I think about that a lot. And I think about a lot what it means that citizenship rights almost never really are the most meaningful in the places where they're supposed to be located. But yeah, so let's try it.
Well, the first question, which I'll mention to you in McGregor, if there's really food there, is dealing with rural versus urban. But the question I had that came just as you were concluding, I was like, wow. When you said that the women themselves were using their bodies and saying, you know,
right,
we're going to use our bodies and all the various ways we're thinking about it to redefine or make a claim about our citizenship. And I was thinking, wow, you know what, in American contemporary culture, at least in my contemporary culture, I've grown up, you know, thinking about citizenship in the terms of abortion rights. You know,
right.
The state can't have my body, and in, you know, in a more contemporary sense, you know, with gays and lesbians saying, look, you know, this is my body, this is my sexual behavior, how dare the state try and jump in? So I guess I'm wondering how you see what you're arguing here, maybe perhaps into being similar or different to these kinds of more contemporary claims that all sorts of people are now using their bodies as a way to say, this is who I am, keep your hands off my body.
I mean, I will say that you know, you sort of are constantly dazed by the fact that these struggles continue, that they never are resolved, and that we're in a moment politically in the United States in which, despite the supposed opposition to the state's expansion, we have this extraordinarily enlarged apparatus of policing that is inserted over the poor and women, our bodies. And so, you know, you think about like what kind of crisis situations foster that like boundary drawing. So you think about immigration in the same terms, the immigration debates. So it does feel, to me, I do think there are lessons to be learned and I think that my own work has always, you know, prejudices me strongly in these, when I live through these things myself. So yes, and I think that in a sense, I don't want to essentialize women, but I really want to not do that, but it's very hard to overlook the fact that citizenship for women is always, it never can escape the body, let's say, because of the way in which the state, you know, interacts with the female body in the sort of interpolation of the duties and rights of citizens. So one of the most important campaigns for full citizenship rights for women is probably the struggle over abortion. So that is sort of, in a sense, something that I think is, you know, I wish it were not the case, but it seems like it's going to be the case for quite a long time. Secondly, I would just say, like, for me as a German historian, other people would say, well, what does this have to do? Okay, so you've analyzed, you know, how women became citizens in this kind of amazing moment of chaos of the defeat, revolution, founding democracy, Then there's this extraordinary Weimar culture in which there's all kinds of opportunities to express oneself in public, including embody oneself in all kinds of new creative ways. But what does this have to do with citizenship since then? Like, the Nazis obviously stripped citizenship of any of its, basically undid all of the kinds of possibilities for claims making. So if I define citizenship that way, there is no citizenship in the Third Reich. There is a heck of a lot of the citizenship of national belonging and through the terms of descent. But I personally think the feminist sort of upsurge of the 70s harkens back to Weimar sexual politics and the sort of this very strong sense of an embodied self. And, you know, it's international too, but there's a certain German take on it that reinscribes a kind of Weimar notion of embodied citizenship that also contests the Nazi legacy. So just bringing it close to a case I almost know better than my own. Yes, Janine.
One of the things that seems really interesting and fruitful in what you said is the way that women are able to make a claim of citizenship based on their personal suffering and experiences during the war. And that sort of struck a chord with me because so much of historical examination of women's citizenship rights is around the idea of mothers being citizens.
Right.
Short in Republican motherhood. And so this seems to really move away from that. And I wonder if you could talk about whether that particular argument comes out of the revolution, which is arguing a more class-based, less gendered idea of citizenship, or if it's a rejection of the government in the war trying so hard to define women as mothers. And so when this new government, this new regime comes out after the war, women are rejecting it. And is there a group, maybe these conservative or Catholic women, who are trying to reappropriate citizenship by saying, well, yes, we suffered in the war, we can all attest to that, but maybe we should think about citizenship and committed motherhood as a more constructive way to contribute to the German state?
Yeah, I'm absolutely, if I look at the spectrum of gendered Weimar citizenships, we have a strong presence, not just of Catholic women are very complex because they're conservative, but in fact they are the biggest advocates and some of the most, you know, the most impressive experts in the expansion of the Weimar welfare state. They're not for reproductive rights, but they are for the amelioration of poverty and inequality. So there's always a dual side, and they're definitely advocates of a new, reinvigorated maternalism. Social democratic women, who are probably the largest contingent, are also very maternalist. In those who go into, and really they become the sort of absolute founders and leaders of most of the sectors of the extremely impressive Weimar welfare state, where the Catholic women are more in the, say, the subsidiary welfare agencies that are less state-based, but in sort of charity groups and neighborhood clinics and so on. Social democratic women see the importance of the welfare, of the realm of welfare as affecting real social change. So they see this as political work. They're not retreating, although a lot of historians view them as like retreating from politics. I don't think so. I think they see it as a deeply political job. But they do accept the kind of conventions of gender, divisions. They're working, so they're not accepting it in that sense. But what you really see are women troubling and puzzling over what political model they should embrace. So the ultra-conservatives, you know, fantasize with male conservatives about, you know, retaking the East, and they want to be the first maternalist figures to go out and re-Germanize Poland, and they are there in 1939 when they accompany German troops with whole contingents of feminist experts who help, you know, classify the Polish population. This is like a bunch of new research has showed that One of the culminations of citizenship is this authorization of women participating in the nation, also as colonizers who witness and participate in the resettlement and mass annihilation of the Slavic and Jewish people. That's absolutely true. So it's a very complex landscape. There isn't one model of citizenship, but I would say the really intriguing ones are the young women who came of age during the war, and probably found the war extremely unsettling and at the same time kind of, disorienting in a good way. And they are hard to win to politics, and they're the ones who enter the public and are very subversive and love the fact that they're citizens, but they don't care about any political parties. But they tend to be extremely visible and the object of lots of political attempts to rein them in, govern them, and it's their sexuality that characterizes that kind of new woman, the woman who falls for fashion, who has no money but finds a way to adorn herself and be this sexually transgressive figure that all of the political parties worry about. And these are these kind of subversive citizens who get unleashed. But interestingly, they come back and join together with the Social Democrats and Communists in the very acute years of the Depression, when the campaigns for birth control and abortion just skyrocket. Because there are 100,000 illegal abortions a year in Germany in 1931 at the height of the crisis, with 25,000, 30,000 women dying. So there's a huge campaign by both of the socialist and communist parties, and all of a sudden you see these new women, these young women who weren't very political, joining these campaigns. So that's where I think that the visions of citizenship right after the war get settled in certain deeply political milieus, but they break down also in the course of Weimar. There were more questions.
Kathleen Canning, for a terrific talk today. I know you all hunger for more discussion, but I think we have to deal with the body as well. And I would urge you to come to lunch to continue the conversation.
And I'll be around the whole time, so I'd love to talk to any of you. Thank you.